This is a good topic. I have written about this in Indian media before, and more recently, I was also interviewed for an article about whether scientists should engage in climate activism. My own personal opinion is that they better spend more time on working on solutions, because we are writing a lot of papers and we keep saying there's a crisis, there's an urgency, and yet we are not working on solutions. And people make very passionate arguments about why activism is a part of our job, but then as soon as anybody even takes a little bit of funding from oil companies, we just brand them as suspicious, even though they may be doing good science. So there is a complicated dance that the climate scientists are having about what their role is in advocating for climate action and the role of climate science in everything, and how important we are to help solve this problem. It's obviously a self-preserving, interest there, because it's our job. We make money from climate science, and we are saying this is really important and society should keep it going. So this article takes a bit of a careful consideration of these issues. The importance of distinguishing climate science from climate activism. It's also called climate communication, where people, without having a 360-degree view of the climate change problem, the socioeconomic aspects, governance aspects, political aspects, and so on, keep on saying very superficial things like we must have early warnings, we must do adaptation, we need risk maps, and these are people who probably cannot even define risk. So I'm obviously concerned as well. So this author Ulf Buntken, I don't know how it's pronounced, I'm concerned by climate scientists becoming climate activists because scholars should not have a priori interests in the outcome of their studies. Likewise, I'm worried about activists who pretend to be scientists, as this can be a misleading form of instrumentalization. How you fake to be, a scientist and then use your own words to propagate these. So this is also referred to as a post-expert era, where anybody can start a Twitter stream, a podcast, YouTube channel like me or whatever, and get a large following, and they become influential voices without really being experts. Okay, so all these are complicated issues, but I'm going to read it. You have to make up your own mind about whether climate scientists should engage in climate activism or not. Okay, what's the background and motivation? It comes as no surprise that the slow production of scientific knowledge by an ever-growing international and interdisciplinary community of climate change researchers is not feasible to track the accelerating pace of cultural, political, and economic perceptions of and actions to the many threats anthropogenic global warming is likely to pose on natural and societal systems at different spatio-temporal scales. Too many things are happening in the real world, and we are reporting something. There are uncertainties in what we do, and especially the predictions and projections, but we are saying nonetheless that this is urgent. We must spend money without knowing what the pros and cons are all the time. Recognition of a decoupling between normal and post-normal science is not new, so you have to also read about this normal and post-normal as opposed to post-expert era as well. The latter, post-normal, often being described as a legitimation of the plurality of knowledge in policy debates that became a liberating insight for many. Characteristic for the yet unfolding phenomenon is an intermingling of science and policy in which political decisions are believed to be without any alternative because they are scientifically predefined, and large parts of the scientific community accept a subordinate role to society because there is an apparent moral obligation. These are really critical words, because society demands something, let's say like 1.5 degree global warming target, and we say, sure, we can give you a pathway for that. Then we use some hokey models to say, this is how we can stay below 1.5. Then we say, oops, we're going to break it, we're going to surpass it, and this is going to happen, that's going to happen, and it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of some sort without any details or separation of science and advocacy and policy. And even the reporters, the young lady who interviewed me for scientists' role, whether they should be participating in climate activism, she used me as just a counterpoint because she had interviewed others who say, yes, we must do this. So she just used me two lines from me saying, oh, well, I also talked to somebody who doesn't agree. And then she filled the article with her own intention. So after she wrote it, I asked her, do you believe climate scientists should be engaged? She said, of course I believe. So her article is basically supporting her own view. So everything looks legitimate, and yet it's a bit misleading in the way it's done. Motivated by the continuous inability of an international agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to tackle global warming, despite an alarming recent rise in surface temperature and associated hydroclimatic extremes, I argue that quasi-religious belief in rather than the understanding of the complex causes and consequences of climate and environmental changes undermines the academic principles. I agree with this as well. I recommend that climate science and climate activism should be separated conceptually and practically, and the latter should not be confused with science communication and public engagement. So separating climate activism from climate science doesn't mean you cannot talk about it or communicate it or do public engagement like giving talks, answering questions. There is always a fine line that translates from communication and awareness building to policy advocating, but still we need to be careful. Climate science and climate activism. While this comment is not a critique of climate activism per se, I am foremost concerned by an increasing number of climate scientists becoming climate activists because scholars should not have a priori interests in the outcome of their studies. Here we are saying, no, there is no choice, we must do this because this is happening, this is real, and yet that really blurs the boundaries of ethical behavior. Well, I don't want to say ethical behavior, but just the science protocol. Like in any academic case, the quest for objectivity must also account for all aspects of global climate change research. While I have no problem with scholars taking public positions on climate issues, I see potential conflicts when scholars use information selectively or over-attribute problems to anthropogenic warming and thus politicize climate and environmental change. So I've railed against attribution and alarmism and so on elsewhere, so I won't say more here. Without self-critique and a diversity of viewpoints, scientists will ultimately harm the credibility of their research and possibly cause a wider public, political and economic backlash. This is very critical because if we use the approach that the end justifies the means, then we will not be different than energy companies or politicians who do that all the time. So we have to be careful as to where we are crossing over, saying it's okay to exaggerate things a little bit to get action going, but who's to determine what is a little bit exaggeration as opposed to just over-attribution, right? Likewise, I'm worried about activists who pretend to be scientists, as this can be a misleading form of instrumentalization. In fact, there is just a thin line between the use and misuse of scientific certainty and uncertainty. So somebody might use uncertainty to delay action, and some might push action despite reasonable uncertainty, especially because in a zero-sum game with limited resources, if we keep on insisting on where resources should be put without knowing what the limitations are or the uncertainties are, then we are really moving resources away from, poor people in many cases, okay? So, in fact, there is just a thin line between the use and misuse of scientific certainty and uncertainty, and there is evidence for strategic and selective communication of scientific information for climate action. Non-specialist activists often adopt scientific arguments as a source of moral legitimation for their movements, which can be radical and destructive rather than rational and constructive. A good example is the leading young lady who's a climate activist of great brand name now. once said there are only X number of years left to save ourselves. This is a garbage terminology and unscientific, but even the UN General Secretary used it at some point. Many people use it, and it's just not scientific in terms of a claim. Okay, I've talked about it elsewhere as well. Unrestricted faith in scientific knowledge is, however, problematic because science is neither entitled to absolute truth nor an ethical authority. A notion, did I skip something here? Yeah, I have screwed up something here. Give me 1 second, I'll pause it and correct it. Okay, sorry about that. These things happen when I am preparing slides. Sometimes I misplace these things. So we are talking about climate science and climate activism, and we left off here. We're talking about non-specialist activists often adopting scientific arguments as a source of moral legitimation for their movements, which can be radical and destructive rather than rational and constructive. Unrestricted faith in scientific knowledge is, however, problematic because science is neither entitled to absolute truth nor ethical authority. The notion of science to be explanatory rather than exploratory is a naive overestimation that can fuel the complex field of global climate change to become a dogmatic ersatz default religion for the wider public. It is also utterly irrational if activists ask to follow the science if there is no single direction. Right? It's a wicked problem. Climate change is a quintessential wicked problem, which means it doesn't really have one solution. It has to be resolved in many directions, which means it has to be resolved again and again. Right? Again, even a clear-cut case like anthropogenically induced global climate change does not justify the deviation from long-lasting scientific standards which have distinguished the academic world from socio-economic and political spheres where advocacy and so-called science just change boundaries or crossed back and forth as necessary. So the role of recent global warming in all this. Moreover, I find it misleading, says the author, when prominent organizations such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its latest summary for policymakers tend to overstate scientific understanding of the rate of recent anthropogenic warming relative to the range of past natural temperature variability over 2,000 and even 125,000 years. The quality and quantity of available climate proxy records are merely too low to allow for a robust comparison of the observed annual temperature extremes in the 21st century against reconstructed long-term climate means of the Holocene, or even, and unfortunately beyond Holocene. Like all science, climate science is tentative and fallible. This universal caveat emphasizes the need for more research to reliably contextualize anthropogenic warming and better understand the sensitivity of the Earth's climate system at different spatio-temporal scales. Along these lines, I agree that the IPCC would benefit from a stronger involvement in economic research and that its neutral reports should inform but not prescribe climate policy. Furthermore, I cannot exclude the ongoing pseudo-scientific chase for record-breaking heat waves and associated hydroclimatic extremes distracts from scientifically guided international achievements of important long-term goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate global warming. So mitigation should go on, but it should keep track of impacts, unintended consequences on poor people. So equity, justice also is needed. The tunnel vision on carbon and emissions reductions must not make poor people suffer more. Right? That's important. It's therefore only a bitter irony that the partial failure of COP28 coincided with the warmest year on record. The temporal overshoot of 2023 now challenges the Paris Agreement to keep global warming well below 2 degrees C. forget 1.5 degrees C, the IPCC special report on exactly this scientifically questionable climate target can be understood as a useful example of science communication that fostered a wide range of climate action. The unprecedented recent temperature rise that follows increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, I think I didn't say it properly. The unprecedented recent temperature rise that follows increasing greenhouse gas concentrations and has been amplified by an ongoing El Nino event is likely to continue in 2024. I'm recording this at the actually beginning of November, and the warmest months have now declined, as is expected. So we have to see now what happens in the next few years. This unparalleled warming, however, has the unpleasant potential to trigger a dangerous zeitgeist, the story of the time, of resignation and disregard. If it happened once, why shouldn't it happen twice? So people might just say, I can't do much anyway, so I'll give up. Okay, this is the really unfortunate outcome of what we are trying to do, despite all the good intentions of trying to save ourselves, right? So then what's the way forward? In essence, I suggest that an ever-growing commingling of climate science, climate activism, climate communication, and climate policy, whereby scientific insights are adopted to promote predetermined positions, not only creates confusion among politicians, stakeholders, and the wider public, but also diminishes academic credibility. So some prominent people love communication, love to be in the media, action, climate action, whatever, lights, action, camera, sorry. Keep saying climate, I'm getting excited here, but anyway, this is a pet peeve of mine. Blurring boundaries between science and activism has the potential to harm movements of environmentalism and climate protection, as well as the much needed international consent for sustainable growth and a global energy transition. If unbound climate activism results in widespread panic or indifference, people may think that it is either too late for action or that action does not matter. This argument is not in disagreement with the idea that mass mobilization as an effective social response to climate change is only possible if society is experiencing sustained levels of risk. Nevertheless, I would argue that motivations are more helpful than restrictions, at least in the long run. So you cannot put up signs everywhere saying, don't travel, don't eat meat, don't do this, don't do that. You need an optimistic vision and a pathway to guide people, right? My criticism of an uncontrolled amalgamation of climate scientists and climate activists should not be understood as a general critique of climate activism, for which there are many constructive ways. So you can read reference 16 of the paper for that, especially when accepting that climate mitigation and adaptation are both desirable options and that non-action can be an important part of activism. Okay? Obviously, if we raise one flag, there will be people who will oppose that idea. If we have one tunnel vision, there are parallel tunnel visions that will emerge. In conclusion, and as a way forward, I recommend that a neutral science should remain unbiased and avoid any form of selection, over-attribution, and reductionism that would reflect a type of activism. Policymakers should continue seeking and considering nuanced information from an increasingly complex media landscape of overlapping academic, economic, and public interests. Advice from a diversity of researchers and institutions beyond the IPCC and other large-scale organizations that assess the state of the knowledge in specific scientific fields should include critical investigations of clear-cut cases such as anthropogenic climate change. IPCC has become an elephant hard to steer right now, and people who are involved in IPCC gain certain crown, certain mantle that they can use in a good way or use it in a bad way, right? A successful international climate agenda, including both climate mitigation and adaptation, requires reliable reporting of detailed and trustworthy certainties and uncertainties, whereas any form of scientism and exaggeration will be counterproductive. So we are always erring on the side of alarmism when we want to respond to questions from the media about what we should be doing, or why any particular event happened, and so on. So there are many issues here that I won't touch on completely, but I've talked about them elsewhere and I have written about them, so you can follow up. But ultimately, you have to decide for yourself, given all the ideas, all the science, all the actions needed, and all the socio-economic issues, societal issues, where do you stand with a 360-degree view of climate change? It's not just a science problem. This would be my main message. Okay, make sure you get a 360-degree view, and don't think your narrow slice of research gave you authority, expertise to talk about everything else, especially in an exaggerated way. Okay, with that litany of complaints, I will leave it here.